If you have a serious discussion with some fighting game fans out there, I think that many of them will feel inclined to tell you that 2025 has actually been a relatively bad year when it comes to balance changes and balance philosophy for fighting games. You have so many communities out there that are begging for a big patch and a relatively decent meta shift for the game, like the case of Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, and even 2XKO to some degree. So in this video, I want to make a big discussion, argument, and talk about why I think that fighting game developers are actually struggling to balance their games and make them feel fair but also fun at the same time. So let's get into it. And for the first point in this video, I really want to talk about character design, because I think that one of the main reasons why it's so hard to make a modern fighting game feel balanced and they have such high power levels in general is because these games, Tekken 8, Street Fighter 6, 2XKO, and whatever other big modern fighting game you can think of, are full of characters that have no weakness on paper, you know. And we're gonna use the example of Echo in 2XKO because I feel like Echo is the prime example of a character that is really strong by design and is not necessarily related to frame data or the way in which his moves behave, and is more connected to how the character on paper just does everything that you would want in a fighting game character in any context. So as I said, let's take the example of Echo. When you boot up 2XKO, you put training mode and you play Echo. Please tell me, what is Echo's weakness on paper by design? You have a character that is supposed to be a heavy mix-up character, right? Like, he's supposed to be the left-right mix-up guy in the game, and also he can do, of course, overhead low mix-ups. But the idea is that if Echo is like right in front of you, if he gets one Oki or one situation in which it is clearly his turn, he's basically going to open you up. The chance of you blocking all of the options that he has are really low, and a lot of people love that type of archetype in fighting games, right? Like, they love their heavy mix-up character. But when you think about it, if that is supposed to be Echo's strength, then what is the weakness? Because he also has some of the best buttons in the game, right? Fast buttons that are really big. He has some of the best supers in the game that are completely safe to use and create even more layers of mix-ups. And then you also have the fact that a character with so many options up close has some of the best zoning and neutral control in the game with Time Winder Bomb, even though it has been, you know, severely nerfed multiple times. And I really do believe that Echo is one of the prime examples of the jack of all trades archetype crisis in the modern era of fighting games, because when you think of the well-rounded characters in fighting games, they used to be characters that were able to do most of all the options in a game, but they didn't really excel at them. You know, they were not significantly powerful in one of those dimensions because they could do all of them. But when you move into modern fighting games, you see this tendency in which the jack of all trades or like well-rounded characters seem to excel at most of the things that they do, and Echo is exactly like that. Even though he's supposed to, you know, be doing all of these different things and be able to play multiple playstyles at the same time, it feels like he's one of the best characters at all of those. For example, who has some of the best mix-ups in 2XKO? Echo. Who has some of the best neutral control and can control the pace of a match the best at 2XKO? Echo. Then, who does some of the best damage and has some of the best Oki situations in the game? Echo. Then, who has some of the best assists, even though they got significantly nerfed, right? My time is much worse than it used to be. You still have Time Wonder assists, so Echo, right? And the list goes on. And I think that this is one of the main reasons why it is so hard to balance modern fighting games, because you have more and more characters that do it all, and they at the same time excel at multiple of those dimensions when maybe they should do all, but not be that good at all of them. Hey, just in the case that you've been enjoying this content until now, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to keep the channel growing. And if you enjoy fighting games, you're probably gonna have a fun time anyway. So thank you for your support, and now let's keep the discussion. And all of this actually opens up my next point in this discussion, which is a consequence of this jack of all trades crisis in modern fighting games. Because when you think about it, if you have so many characters that are good in multiple gameplay playstyles and they excel at multiple dimensions at the same time, it is really hard to define their character identity. And what happens is that character identity and the definition of gameplay style kind of like dissipates. It starts to disappear. And let's take again the example of Echo and other characters in other games, like Ryu in Street Fighter 6 after all the buffs that he has gotten, and some top tiers in Tekken 8, like for example Anna or even Brian. And when you think about these characters, of course they are good in multiple things, they excel at multiple dimensions like I said, so how do you nerf or buff them without taking away some of the favorite things of the player base of these characters? Like if you take Echo and for example you significantly nerf all of the things that are not related to his high-level mix-up identity. You know, you nerf the neutral control, you nerf the assist, and you make him a fully base, like left-right mix-up character. Some people are gonna stop playing Echo because they actually like the other side of the character. And then we also have the example of someone like Ryu in Street Fighter 6, right? What is Ryu's character identity after so many buffs? Like, the character can hit you like a truck, really high damage. He also has some of the best buttons and special moves in the game, and he has some of the best plus frame situations for him when it comes to pressure, but he also can zone you better than Guile. So what exactly makes Ryu Ryu in Street Fighter 6 in comparison to how he was, for example, in the Alpha series, on Third Strike, or in older games in which he was very clearly able to do most or play a lot of playstyles, but he didn't really excel at any of them. And right now, he's kind of like one of the best characters at all of the dimensions in which you can play Ryu. And then you can make the example that the same thing happens in Tekken 8. Let's take the example of Anna, arguably the best character in the game right there in Season 2. And when you think of Anna, she used to be a very high risk, high reward character in other Tekken games, and now she's just good at everything. And the reward is not really related to risk, it's just always high reward. She has some of the best poking in the game, some of the best pressure up close, still some of the best 50-50, which was her identity before, but now can be much more safe with relatively similar and very consistent reward. Then she does insane damage, she has insane like heat mix-ups and options. So like, what is Anna's identity now? She's just good at everything, like many of the other jack of all trades and master of all of them characters in modern fighting games. And of course, there are so many reasons out there as to why some developers take this approach, or maybe it's hard for them to actually define the identity of a character and not make them just a well-rounded monster. And I think that the reasons are, for example, that they want to appeal to bigger audiences, right? So they want you to pick up a character maybe because they look cool and actually appeal to multiple types of players and people at the same time. Then you also have the fact that over the years, modern fighting games in general have kind of like smaller rosters than older games. So if you want to appeal to a bigger mass audience, you need to be able to fill out all the archetypes that you can with less characters. And there are multiple ways in which you can argue why this is happening, but I think that it's contributing to kind of like the balance crisis of modern fighting games. And then the third point of the discussion appears, which is much bigger, and it is that in a lot of modern fighting games there is also a very like bloated and big amount of general system mechanics, and a lot of the modern fighting games out there are trying to make all of the roster in their games relatively strong because the mechanics that everyone has access to are insanely good. And I think that the best example here is actually Street Fighter 6, because when you check Street Fighter 6 as a game, a lot of the things that make characters strong are related to the drive system, you know, to drive rush, to also parry, and all of the ways in which characters can do universal options that are really good. And this of course not only connects to the second point, which is that it diminishes character identity even more, but it also kind of makes the gameplay of some of these modern fighting games more homogeneous. You know, like you see people having the same playstyle over and over, even if they play really different characters, because using the system mechanics and kind of like basing your game plan in those universal mechanics is a much more strong playstyle than actually trying to use the more unique and like specific options that your character has. So for example, if you're playing King, let's say in Tekken 8, and you're a grappler, right? Like one of the things that makes King fun is grabbing people, and maybe you have heat on and it's almost about to end. What would you choose? Would you do a command grab on someone or do your heat smash? And heat smash is the general universal option, and the command grab is the King base, you know, a specific gameplay style option. And I think that most of you would do the heat smash because the option is just so good that there is no reason to change it for the more specific style one, when you could just use the universal mechanic to win consistently. And I believe that this is also contributing to not only the problem with character identity and how these jack of all trades characters are even stronger, because it's not only that they are really strong and excel on multiple dimensions and then they lose their identity in the more specific dimensions in which you want to play them, but it's also that you put the system mechanics on top of that and you create these insanely strong monster characters that not only do it all, but they use the system mechanics of the game better than the weaker ones, you know, the weaker characters in the roster. And it's just kind of like a step-by-step base or like philosophy in which you create these atrocious characters that can just do it all. And well, now as a closing thought and the last point in this video, I want to talk about accessibility, because I think that many of the reasoning and motivation behind some of these problems or points that I've been making in this video is related to making fighting games easier, because of course developers want bigger audiences to get into their games, and they want more money, and also they want newer fans, because whether we like it or not, if no new people get into fighting games, the genre is gonna die eventually, you know, with the people that played them in the 90s and 2000s and now. So I think that their motivation is fine. Like, it's okay to make fighting games relatively easier in a newer, you know, beginner level, so that people can get into them much quicker. But the problem is, how do you reconcile that with the balancing, with the gameplay design, with the character identity of your roster, and with the strength of your universal mechanics? It's a big discussion, and I think that it has a lot of value to talk about this and to kind of like see it on a more reasonable way and not make it just a rant. You know, I really tried to make it a relatively more serious and organized video. And I think that the best example of this, you know, connection between the accessibility thing and all of these balance issues is actually protagonist characters in fighting games. Because if you look at who should be or is the protagonist of multiple modern fighting games, they are also a prime example of the like jack of all trades, master of all character. Jin in Tekken 8, for example, a terrorist character in Season 1 and is still insanely strong. Then Ryu and Ken on SF6 have been strong since release, and now Ryu has taken, you know, the big kind of like protagonist side because of all the buffs, but he was not weak on Season 1. I would say that he was okay. And then in 2XKO, it is very obvious that Yasuo, Echo, and aAre, for example, are kind of like the quote-unquote protagonist characters, and they have the same problem, or they kind of like are an example of some of the points I made in this video. And of course, protagonist characters are for beginners. Like, they are thought out to be the characters by which you are gonna get into a fighting game. And it is quite interesting that they represent, at this point in time, some of these big balance issues or balance, you know, discussions that you can have around the future of the genre. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I tried to make a really interesting discussion, and I wanted to point out what I think about all of these problems from a more organized, you know, and like mature way, and not as a rant. So hopefully you didn't take it, you know, as me just complaining. If you enjoyed the video, of course, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Leave a comment with what you think about all of these topics, and keep enjoying fighting games.